The morning of April 3rd, 2024 began like any other inside Crestfield State Prison, a high-security women's facility buried deep in rural Arkansas. At the medical wing, a nurse named Celia Ramirez was sorting the results from the monthly health screening standard tests ordered by the Department of Corrections, including blood panels, HIV testing, and pregnancy screens. It was routine, predictable, something no one gave a second thought to. Until she opened the chart for inmate 92415 Darlene Cook. At first, Celia thought it was a mistake. The pregnancy test was clearly positive. So was the HIV panel. She blinked, reread the file, and immediately requested a recheck. Then she looked at the next two charts, Maya Jenkins and Leah Thomas, both HIV positive. All three women had been held in solitary confinement for months. No conjugal visits. No physical contact with anyone outside. No male guards were assigned to the female-only segregation wing. And yet, somehow one of them was pregnant, and all three were carrying the same incurable virus. Within the hour, the entire prison went into chaos. Word spread like fire through the corridors. Nurses whispered behind closed doors. Guards muttered in disbelief near the control booths. Rumors exploded through the inmate population like a bomb. Some said the tests were wrong. Others suspected drug use, secret sexual relationships, even witchcraft. No one could make sense of it. And in the middle of the storm, three women sat in separate cells, silent, stunned, and visibly shattered by what they had just learned. Darlene collapsed in the corner of her bunk, clutching her stomach and sobbing without sound, her eyes wide with disbelief and something else shame. Maya refused to speak at all, turning her face to the wall and pulling her knees to her chest, as if shrinking into herself might make the truth disappear. Leah, usually defiant and vocal, trembled uncontrollably, asking over and over, "Am I going to die with the kind of raw fear that cuts deeper than any scream?" They were not confused. They were not angry. They were absolutely terrified. Prison administrators scrambled to come up with explanations. They blamed clerical errors, faulty equipment, even suggested the tests were accidentally switched with someone else's. But deep down, everyone knew this was no accident. Something had happened, something deliberate, something monstrous, and someone inside these walls had done it. When the warden summoned each woman for questioning, the response was the same silence. They would not talk, would not accuse, would not even look the investigators in the eye. Their fear was palpable, suffocating. Hours passed, days, but eventually, one of them cracked. Leah spoke first. Her voice was low, trembling, barely audible. She said there was a guard, one of the night officers, who would call them out, one at a time, always after lights out. He would tell them his office needed to be cleaned. No cameras, no paperwork, just his voice on the intercom, and the heavy sound of his boots as he waited in the shadows. Once they stepped inside, he locked the door, and then he did things to them, violent things, repetitive, cruel, threatening. He told them if they said anything, he would make sure they disappeared, said he had friends, said he knew where their families lived. And the worst part, the part that made the entire room fall silent, was when Leah added that she had overheard him once, laughing on the phone, bragging about how he liked to share the disease. She had not understood what he meant at the time, but now she did. The man in question was Officer Ray Lanning, a trusted senior guard. On paper, he had an impeccable record, 10 years of service, clean conduct, respected by staff, known for keeping things quiet on his watch. But outside the prison, in the shadows of strip clubs and back alley bars, he was a different man, a predator, a heavy drinker with a long list of one-night stands. And, as the investigation would reveal, he had been diagnosed with HIV nearly 4 years earlier. He never disclosed his status, never wore protection, and according to Leah, he never once showed regret. Within 2 weeks of the test results, Darlene Cook was found dead in her cell. She had fashioned a noose out of her bedsheet and hanged herself in the early morning hours. When the guards were switching shifts, there was no sign of struggle, just a handwritten note folded beneath her pillow, 7 shaky words. barely legible through the smudged ink of dried tears. "I cannot bring his child into this." Her death sent shock waves across the state. Protesters gathered outside the gates. Former inmates began speaking out. Journalists descended on Crestfield with cameras and microphones. And behind the wall, the truth that had festered. At first, Nurse Celia Ramirez thought the test was just a glitch, a fluke in the system, maybe a mislabeled sample. But when she ran the second set and the results came back exactly the same, her hands began to shake. She sat in the corner of the Crestfield Infirmary, staring at the three folders in her lap. Darlene Cook, Maya Jenkins, Leah Thomas. 3 names she barely knew. 3 women in isolation, under strict supervision, with no access to one another and no contact with the outside world. Yet somehow, all 3 had tested positive for HIV, and one of them, Darlene, was pregnant. Celia checked the records again. The lab IDs matched, blood drawn, labeled, and sealed under protocol. No errors in the chain of custody, no signs of contamination. These weren't bad samples. They were real. She felt a cold sweat crawl down her spine. All 3 women had been in solitary confinement for over 90 days. No recreation time, no visits. The only people allowed near them were licensed medical staff and 6 certified correctional officers assigned to night shifts on rotation. That was it. And yet, somehow, someone had done this to them. Someone had crossed that line in a place that was supposed to be airtight. Within hours, Celia alerted the prison's medical director. The warden was brought in. Files were sealed. An internal meeting was called with senior administrators, but it felt more like a containment briefing than a crisis response. The first words out of the deputy warden's mouth were not about the victims, but about media fallout and legal exposure. He wanted the health records locked down. No one was to speak to the press. No formal statements were to be made. But the walls of Crestfield were thinner than they looked. By sundown, whispers were spreading. Nurses began murmuring in the hallway. Guards shot each other sideways glances in the control rooms. Even the inmates, most of whom hadn't spoken in weeks, started calling out through the slots in their steel doors. "Who got it?" one asked. Did they say HIV? Asked another. Rumors bloomed in every direction. Some blamed reused needles. Others suspected black market drugs laced with infected blood. One guard even claimed it was voodoo. But there was one rumor that no one dared say out loud, not yet. That someone inside Crestfield was doing things at night, things the cameras couldn't see, and that whoever he was, he had infected those women on purpose. When Darlene was brought in for re-examination, she looked like she had not slept in days. Her hands shook. Her eyes were hollow. She sat quietly on the edge of the cot while Celia explained the test results. At first, she didn't react. She just stared at the floor, blinking slowly, as though she had expected this. Then, almost inaudibly, she whispered, "No, that's not possible." When Celia tried to offer her the printout of the report, Darlene backed away as if it were a weapon. 5 minutes later, she curled into a ball on the exam table, both arms wrapped tightly around her midsection, whispering to herself over and over, "Not again, please, not again." Maya's reaction was different, quiet, detached. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't scream. She simply turned her face to the wall and let a single tear run down her cheek. When the counselor asked if she wanted someone to talk to, she shook her head. Later, a guard found a scribbled line in the margin of her Bible. He said, "I was nothing. Now I believe him." Leah was the loudest. The second she saw the paper in Celia's hand, she grabbed it and flung it across the room. "You're all liars," she screamed. "This is a setup. You're trying to scare us." It took 2 officers to hold her down, and even then she fought them, kicking and screaming, repeating one phrase over and over like it was a curse. "He said I'd be safe if I shut up. He said I'd be safe if I shut up." That was the moment everything changed. Because those weren't the words of someone who didn't understand what was happening. They were the words of someone who had known for a long time and had been living in fear ever since. Behind the walls of solitary confinement, Fear had become normal. Silence had become survival. But now the veil was lifting, and what it revealed sent shockwaves through the entire facility. In the days that followed, all three women changed. Darlene stopped speaking altogether. Even her cellmate, a soft-spoken woman named Nia Holloway, said she barely moved. She just sat on her bed, Nia later told investigators, like she was holding death in her stomach. At night, Darlene would rock back and forth, whispering into the darkness, her hands cradling her belly as if trying to decide whether it was part of her or a parasite. Maya stopped eating. She refused medication, wouldn't open her mouth even when asked a direct question. When a nurse touched her arm for a blood draw, she recoiled so violently she fell off the cot. Leah lashed out. She kicked her door, screamed at the guards, and refused her meal. Once, she carved a word into her mattress with the edge of a toothbrush. Liar. Another time, she spat in a male officer's face and shouted, "You're all in on it." Still, no names were spoken, no official complaint filed, no statement recorded. But then the pattern started to emerge. All three women had been under the supervision of the same correctional officer during night shifts for the past several weeks. His name appeared over and over in rotation schedules. He had logged more late-night door accesses than any other guard, and when one nurse finally made the connection out loud during a private briefing, the room fell into silence. "Ray Lanning," she said. A name that had meant nothing the week before. Now, it was everything. After the name Ray Lanning was first spoken behind closed doors, something shifted inside Crestfield, not just in the offices or briefing rooms, but in the walls themselves, as if the building had been holding its breath and was now exhaling something foul. Ray had always blended into the backdrop. 10 years on staff. Clean record, known for being punctual, quiet, by the book. He didn't drink coffee in the break room or gossip like the others. He walked his rounds, filed his reports, and kept his distance. No one had ever questioned him because no one ever had a reason to. That was his strength. He didn't make noise. But now that silence had begun to scream, Warden Ellis, under increasing scrutiny from internal oversight, ordered that each of the three women be interviewed separately by an outside investigator from the Department of Corrections. The strategy was clear: eliminate bias, establish trust, extract a name if one existed. Leah went first. She was brought into the observation room under heavy restraint, her wrists cuffed, ankles shackled, but her eyes burned with fury. She refused to sit at first, paced, spat insults, accused the prison of covering it all up. The investigator, a woman named Margaret Lane with a calm voice and years of trauma experience, didn't push. She let Leah burn through the rage until the silence came. And then, in a voice hoarse from screaming, Leah stopped pacing, sat down, and whispered, "You want to know who did it?" Margaret didn't move, just nodded slowly. "Ray Lanning," Leah said. "He's the one. You already know that, don't you?" Margaret's pen hovered over the notepad. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Leah added, "He started coming after lights out, always after lights out. He'd buzz the intercom and say, 'You're needed for cleaning duty.' That's what he called it, cleaning duty." She described the pattern. He'd take one girl at a time, no cameras, no witnesses, no logs, just the sound of his boots and the lock clicking shut. He had this rule, Leah continued. If you screamed, you disappeared. If you told, your family disappeared. He knew where my sister lived, told me straight to my face. And when he was done, he made me mop the floor, said it would help me feel useful. She paused, clenched her fists, then added, "You think the virus was an accident?" He laughed when I cried, said he was doing the world a favor. The next day, Darlene broke her silence. She had requested to see a counselor, her first and only request since the medical exam. The counselor described her as fragile, disoriented, trembling like someone in shock. When asked what happened, Darlene didn't speak right away. She just stared at the wall and whispered, "He said we belonged to him, like property. Said no one would care." Her tone was flat, detached, as though her mind had splintered from her body. The only thing she asked was to never see him again. "Don't let him near me," she repeated, over and over, until the session ended. Maya came last. She didn't name Ray, not directly, but she described the same ritual, the same call over the intercom, the same walk to the storage room. She wouldn't describe everything that happened inside. She just said, "He liked it when I stopped breathing. When I panicked, that's when he got mean." 3 stories, 3 timelines, 3 nearly identical descriptions. It wasn't just misconduct, it was a pattern. And still, administration hesitated. There was no official log of the alleged incidents, no security footage from inside the rooms, no DNA evidence yet. What they had were voices, broken voices, voices the system was trained to doubt. But the investigator wasn't ready to walk away. She requested access to internal movement records, door logs, badge scans, late-night sign-outs. Reluctantly, the IT supervisor handed over the data. What they found cracked the case wide open. Ray's security badge had accessed the segregation unit during late-night hours more than 40 times in 2 months. On nearly half those nights, no activity was recorded in his written logs, no incidents, no medical transfers, no sanitation requests, just electronic pings, entries into restricted corridors with no explanation. More disturbing still, on 5 occasions, his badge accessed the locked infirmary hallway well after midnight, despite no nurses on duty and no inmates scheduled for medical review. And, twice, hallway cameras caught Darlene following him quietly down the corridor, her arms folded tightly across her chest, eyes on the floor. She wasn't cuffed. There was no escort report. The timestamp read 2:13 a.m. When the footage was shown to Warden Ellis, he reportedly went pale. He asked how many people had seen the video. The answer, 3. He ordered them not to speak about it. "Not until we know for sure," he said. But they already knew. The tension inside Crestfield turned electric. More inmates began speaking in code. A nurse found a note tucked into a blood pressure cuff that read, "Ask about the office mop closet." One correctional officer quietly turned in his resignation, claiming he couldn't be part of this anymore. A mental health aide reported that Maya had tried to cut her arms with a sharpened spoon when asked why. She simply said, "Because he said I was marked now." Outside the prison, the story had not yet broken, but inside, the storm was building. And Ray Lanning. He continued clocking in, continued walking the halls, continued saying nothing, until someone found the piece that made everything impossible to ignore. And when that piece surfaced, the walls of Crestfield would finally begin to crack. The walls didn't crumble overnight. They never do. But once the cracks started, the collapse became inevitable. It began with Officer James Talbot. He was average in every sense, mid-30s, thinning hair, 2 kids at home, a mortgage he barely kept up with. For 6 months, he had worked the night shift with Ray Lanning. He wasn't particularly close to him, nor did he ask questions. But after Darlene's suicide attempt, an event that hadn't even made it to public record yet, Talbot started having trouble sleeping. And one night, when investigators asked to speak with staff about routine security protocol, he asked to speak off the record. Sitting across from the 2 agents from the Arkansas Bureau of Criminal Investigation, Talbot didn't seem nervous, just tired. He leaned forward, folded his hands forward and said, "I don't want to lie anymore." He hadn't seen anything directly, he clarified, but he'd noticed things. Ray taking inmates out of their cells without logging it. Ray signing out infirmary keys after nurses had gone home. Ray making offhand comments like, "They know better than to open their mouths," or, "It's not rape if nobody remembers it." There was one night he couldn't forget. He'd seen Darlene returning from Ray's office around 3:00 a.m. She looked disoriented, pale, clutching her sides as if trying to hold herself together. Her lips were swollen, her eyes hollow. Talbot asked her if she needed the infirmary. Before she could answer, Ray stepped between them and said, "She tripped, slipped on a mop bucket." Then he smiled. Talbot had believed him at the time, or maybe he just wanted to. The investigators thanked him, then they pulled badge records. Ray's keycard activity didn't just suggest misconduct, it practically confirmed it. Across 74 nights, his ID logged 39 after-hours entries into restricted units. On 5 nights, he accessed the locked medical hallway even though no patients were scheduled and no staff were present. The security footage, limited but damning, captured glimpses of inmates walking beside him in the early hours of the morning. No restraints, no paperwork, no justification. One clip stood out. April 1st, 2:36 a.m. Maya Jenkins, head down, hands clasped, being led silently down the hallway. Ray kept a step ahead of her. Neither of them spoke. 15 minutes later, she returned alone, walking slower, hugging her arms across her chest. When Ray was asked about that night, he claimed he wasn't on shift. But the time card system told a different story. Meanwhile, inside the prison, unrest was spreading. Darlene's condition had worsened. Though she hadn't spoken a full sentence in days, her cellmate reported that she had started talking in her sleep, frantic, broken whispers. "He's in me," she muttered one night. "I can't get it out." She stopped taking her medication, hid her prenatal supplements beneath her mattress. When a counselor asked if she wanted to see a doctor, she shook her head and whispered, "It won't matter. Nothing matters anymore." Leah spiraled. After hearing rumors that Ray was still working night shifts, she carved the word monster into her forearm using a toothbrush handle. Maya went completely silent, writing only a single sentence in a torn-out Bible page. "You let him in." Then came the leak. Someone inside the infirmary. No one ever confirmed who sent an anonymous message to a local journalist who had been covering prison reform issues for years. Attached was a photo of a suicide note. 7 handwritten words, shaky, smudged with what looked like dried tears. "I cannot bring his child into this." The note exploded across social media like a grenade. Justice for Darlene trended nationwide within 12 hours. Advocacy groups demanded a federal probe. Protesters gathered outside the gates with signs that read, "Your silence is violence, and who's protecting them?" A petition for a full investigation into Crestfield gathered over 50,000 signatures by morning. Inside, the atmosphere changed from fear to fury. Inmates refused meals. Guards began calling in sick. Nurses whispered about quitting. Even the warden couldn't deny what was happening anymore. He called a full staff briefing and tried to calm the tension, but his words fell flat. "There will be accountability," he said. "We're reviewing everything." But his eyes betrayed him. He looked scared. And he should have been. Because the final nail was coming hand-delivered by someone who had kept a terrible secret for far too long. Her name was Janet Crowley. She had worked as a nurse at Crestfield for 12 years, known for being meticulous, quiet, deeply committed to her patients, even if they wore orange. When she walked into the investigator's temporary office 1 week after the leak, she carried a USB drive and a folder full of photocopied records. And what she brought changed everything. Inside the folder were medical documents faxed years ago by mistake from a hospital in Memphis. The recipient was the Crestfield Medical Department, but the subject line said employee record. It was Ray Lanning's name. The diagnosis HIV positive. December 3rd, 2019. The file was marked for mandatory disclosure. A note from the hospital's infectious disease unit highlighted the words "patient advised to inform all partners. Recommend treatment immediately." But Ray had never reported it. Janet had found the file years ago in a misrouted fax bin. She assumed it had been followed up. It hadn't. And now, with everything happening, she couldn't keep quiet anymore. When the investigators read the report, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Ray hadn't just abused his authority. He had weaponized his diagnosis, hidden it, used it, And now 3 women were living with the consequences, and one of them had died because of it. The next morning, the state issued a warrant for Ray Lanning's arrest. He didn't resist. When the officers knocked on his door, he opened it like he'd been expecting them. He didn't ask why. He didn't even flinch as they placed the cuffs on his wrists. But one of the arresting officers later said something that stuck with the lead detective. He was smiling. The officer said, not a smirk, not smug, just empty. Like he knew this was always going to happen. And now it finally had. Ray Lanning's arrest made headlines before the ink had even dried on the warrant. Local outlets ran it first, correctional officer charged in Crestfield abuse case, but within hours, the national media picked it up. By sundown, his name and face were everywhere. Mugshot, charges, timeline, a blurred image of the suicide note, a timeline of his access logs. One anchor called it the most horrifying abuse of institutional power the state has seen in decades. But for those inside Crestfield, it wasn't headlines that changed things. It was the sound of the gates slamming behind him. The inmates didn't cheer. There was no celebration, just a quiet shift in the atmosphere, as if the entire prison had been holding its breath, and now finally exhaled. Darlene was already gone. 2 weeks before, she had tied a bedsheet around the top bunk in her cell and stepped off the edge without hesitation. Her body was discovered at 6:47 a.m., knees barely brushing the floor. There was no scream, no flinch, just stillness. The autopsy confirmed what most already knew: she hadn't touched her medication in weeks, had hidden it under her mattress along with the note. "I cannot bring his child into this." Those 7 words became the rallying cry of a movement. Maya Jenkins didn't attend the trial. She was still serving a sentence for armed robbery. Though the Department of Justice had quietly initiated a clemency review, she watched the footage from a secured room inside another facility. Her reaction to the arrest was quiet, almost numb. When a counselor asked how she felt, she said simply, "I'm still infected. He still wins." But she didn't mean it, not fully. Because for the first time since her assault, Maya began eating again, began talking again, and a week later, she asked to speak during the sentencing hearing, not because she wanted closure, but because she refused to let someone else tell her story for her. Leah Thomas, however, was loud. The morning of Ray's arrest, she stood in front of the unit door and screamed his name, not out of fear but defiance. "You don't own me," she shouted, "not anymore." That day, she refused her scheduled therapy session, but requested a blank notebook instead. By the end of the week, she had written 30 pages, part testimony, part manifesto. She called it "The Silence They Gave Us." She mailed copies to 3 senators, 2 journalists, and 1 nonprofit legal clinic. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted consequences. Warden Ellis, meanwhile, was barely holding the facility together. Staff resignations piled up. 3 guards quit outright. 1 nurse went on indefinite leave. A counselor requested transfer. Outside the gates, protests surged. Candles lined the fence. Photos of Darlene in her intake uniform, eyes down, arms crossed, were taped to the razor wire by strangers who had never met her. Some carried signs that read, "Say her name." Others held banners with just 7 words. The state moved fast. The charges against Ray were staggering: 6 counts of aggravated sexual assault, 3 counts of intentional transmission of HIV, 1 count of criminal abuse of authority, 2 counts of falsifying official records, and 1 count of negligent homicide tied directly to Darlene Cook's suicide. His attorney requested bail. The judge denied it. During his arraignment, Ray said nothing. He stood stone-faced, shoulders squared, as the charges were read aloud, but a courtroom photographer captured something 1 split second as he was being led away in handcuffs. A smirk, small, faint, but it was there. That image went viral. Side by side with Darlene's suicide note, it lit up feeds across the country. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about a system that had allowed him to walk through the cracks, unchecked, for years. A system that had seen the signs and looked away. Civil rights groups filed motions. The ACLU launched a lawsuit against Crestfield and the Department of Corrections. Survivors from other prisons began coming forward stories of late-night cleaning duty, of threats, of pregnancies that were hushed up and terminated in secret. Most had no evidence, but now they had each other. And they had Darlene. Her funeral had been small, private, just her mother and 2 aunts, escorted by state troopers. No press allowed. Her body was cremated, her ashes returned in a plain box with no inscription. No one from the prison attended. No one from the Department of Corrections sent flowers. But outside, strangers did. They mailed letters, held vigils, started scholarships in her name. And one mural painted on the side of a youth center in Little Rock captured her likeness with a soft expression and the words of her note rising behind her like a banner. "I cannot bring his child into this." When asked why she painted it, the artist said, "Because I needed girls to see what happens when no one listens, and what changes when someone finally does." Ray's trial was scheduled for the fall. The prosecution promised to present undeniable evidence of systemic abuse, deliberate silence, and institutional failure. The defense tried to argue that there was no physical proof of rape, that consent was never disproven, and that the virus could have come from anywhere. But behind closed doors, even his legal team knew they were not defending a man anymore. They were defending a legacy of denial. And this time, the silence wasn't going to protect anyone. The trial of Ray Lanning began on a cold Monday morning in October. The courthouse in Pulaski County was flanked by metal barricades and news vans, with protesters on one side and survivors' advocates on the other. Everyone had shown up for different reasons, but with the same name on their lips. Darlene Cook. Her name appeared in opening statements, on posters outside, in the hands of Maya Jenkins as she clutched a folded copy of the suicide note. Her voice was absent, but her words were everywhere. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Ray Lanning sat at the defense table in a dark suit that looked too crisp for someone who had been behind bars for 5 months. His hair was cropped shorter than usual, his face unreadable. Some reporters called it stoic, others called it hollow, but no one missed the contrast between his clean collar and the gravity of what he'd done. The prosecution opened with a simple sentence. This is not just a case about one man abusing power, it is a case about what happens when a system lets him. Then they laid out the evidence piece by piece. Keycard logs showing Ray entering the segregation unit more than 40 times after hours with no corresponding reports filed. Security footage showing him walking inmates down restricted hallways with no medical justification. Testimonies from Maya, Leah, and staff who had witnessed strange patterns but had been too afraid to speak. And finally, the HIV diagnosis dated 2019 with medical recommendations for disclosure that Ray had ignored. The prosecutors didn't embellish. They didn't need to. The facts alone painted a picture darker than anything they could have written. When Maya Jenkins took the stand, the room fell silent. She didn't speak with fury. She didn't even look at Ray. Her voice was soft, steady, but each word carried weight. "I wasn't supposed to be a victim again," she said. "I already broke the law. I already paid my price. But he made me feel like I didn't deserve protection. Like being locked up meant I was fair game." She described the first time Ray summoned her over the intercom, how he told her she'd lose yard privileges if she didn't comply, how he closed the door behind her and locked it. He smiled. She said, not like he was proud, like he was curious how far he could go. When the defense asked if she had ever said the word no, Maya just looked at them and answered, "He had keys. I had a mattress and a toilet. You tell me what no sounds like in there." Leah Thomas's testimony was less composed. She entered the courtroom wearing civilian clothes for the first time in years, granted early release due to her cooperation. Her voice cracked the moment she saw Ray. "He made me think no one would ever care," she said, "that I could scream, and it would echo forever in that cell, and no one would ever hear it." She stared straight at him as she spoke, not blinking, not wavering. "You don't get to smirk anymore," she said. "You don't get to hide behind that badge or your silence." When the prosecutor asked if she remembered anything Ray had said during the assaults, Leah's voice dropped to a whisper. "He called me a hole, just a hole, and said no one would care what happened to one." The courtroom froze. Even the judge sat back in his chair. The defense tried to argue consent. They pushed the narrative that the women had motivations, clemency, attention, even revenge. They questioned timelines, poked holes in records, claimed the footage proved nothing without direct audio or visual confirmation of assault. But it wasn't working. The jury wasn't just listening to evidence. They were watching 3 women describe being broken and then forced to carry the weight of proving it happened. Then came the moment no one expected. Darlene's mother was called to the stand. She hadn't spoken to the press, hadn't attended rallies, but she came to court for this. Dressed in black, holding the cremation box in her lap, she spoke not as a political voice, but as a mother. She was quiet. She said, "My Darlene was always quiet. She never told me when she was hurting, but I knew." She opened the folded note and read it aloud. "I cannot bring his child into this." Then she looked at the jury and said, "I don't care what the law says about guilt. I know what he took. And if you let him walk out of here, he'll take something else from someone else." Her testimony wasn't long, but it was enough. The next day, the jury returned their verdict guilty on all counts. Aggravated sexual assault, intentional transmission of HIV, abuse of authority, falsifying records, negligent homicide. Ray didn't move, didn't blink, just stared forward as the words were read out, lips pressed tight, but the smirk long gone. The sentence was swift life in prison, no possibility of parole. The court cleared quickly after that. No celebration, just quiet relief, a sense that something, finally, had cracked open. Ray was transferred that same night to a maximum security prison in another county, placed in protective custody. Rumors said he was attacked within a week of arriving. No confirmation, no real concern. Most people had already moved on to the victims, to the laws, to the reckoning. Because the story wasn't over. Not even close. The trial was over, but the echo of it kept growing. For weeks after the verdict, Crestfield Prison remained under federal review. The Department of Justice launched a sweeping investigation into all correctional facilities in the state, citing a systemic failure to protect incarcerated women. Warden Ellis resigned quietly. The Department of Corrections issued a statement promising sweeping reform, but few believed them. It didn't matter. The pressure was already outside their hands. Legislators, some of whom had never once toured a prison, suddenly found themselves face-to-face with advocates, survivors, and mothers carrying framed photos of daughters who hadn't been as lucky as Leah or Maya. Protesters showed up at state capitals, not just in Arkansas, but across the country, holding signs that read, "She was never safe. Cages do not erase humanity. 7 words changed everything." And those words, they were everywhere. "I cannot bring his child into this." The suicide note that had once been buried under a prison mattress was now carved into stone, literally. A memorial plaque was placed at the base of a mural in downtown Little Rock. The mural itself was a 12-foot-high painting of Darlene Cook, looking skyward, her face caught between shadow and light, a single tear trailing down her cheek. People came in silence, lit candles, left notes. Some whispered prayers. Some left photos of loved ones lost to abuse behind bars. But it wasn't just about mourning. It was about rage, change, justice. 6 months after Ray Lanning's conviction, The Arkansas state legislature passed the Cook Act, a sweeping reform bill that required full 24/7 surveillance coverage in all solitary and restricted housing units, mandatory disclosure and annual renewal of employee medical records related to communicable diseases, independent reporting channels for inmates to file complaints outside the chain of command, third-party audits of correctional facilities every 2 years. It was the most comprehensive prison reform law in the state's history. National organizations praised it. Other states began drafting similar bills. Civil rights attorneys called it a blueprint born from blood. But for the women who had lived through the silence, the pain didn't fade with legislation. Maya Jenkins was released under a clemency order shortly after the trial. She declined interviews, changed her name, moved to another state. She entered an HIV treatment program supported by a victim assistance organization and quietly began rebuilding her life. Her last public statement was a single sentence: "He doesn't get to own the rest of me." Leah Thomas took a different path. She became the face of a movement testifying before state panels, giving interviews, and working with nonprofit coalitions focused on incarcerated women's rights. She refused to clean up her story. She told the ugly parts, the quiet parts, the parts that made people shift in their chairs. "I'm not here to make you comfortable," she once said on live television. "I'm here because Darlene can't be." She still carried the suicide note in her wallet. Darlene's mother, too, remained active. Though she never became a public speaker, she attended every hearing related to the Cook Act, sat in the front row, never said a word, just held the urn in her lap. The media stopped trying to interview her after a while. They realized her silence said enough. And Ray. He disappeared into the prison system, swallowed by the very walls he once controlled. Rumors swirled. Some said he was attacked. Others said he was placed in isolation. No one really knew, and no one really asked. Because by then, the focus had shifted to the larger truth. This wasn't just about one man. This was about the silence that allowed him to thrive, about the systems that prioritized order over justice, about a culture that assumed punishment erased the need for protection. And Darlene Cook, once inmate 9241, once invisible, had become something more than a victim. She had become a reckoning. In classrooms, her name was taught alongside landmark civil rights cases. In prisons, her story became part of training manuals for staff. In advocacy circles, she was remembered not just for how she died, but for what her death forced the world to confront. Because sometimes, it takes the quietest voice to start the loudest revolution. And sometimes, 7 words are louder than any scream. "I cannot bring his child into this." Her name was Darlene Cook. She entered prison to serve a sentence and never came out alive. She never asked to be a symbol. She never wanted to be a headline, but her pain forced the world to see what had been hiding for far too long. Because behind locked gates and steel doors, there are still victims. And sometimes, the only way we learn the truth is when one of them doesn't survive long enough to tell it. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that truth deserves a voice, even behind bars, then subscribe to our channel. We will keep telling them, we will keep digging, because silence protects predators. And stories like Darlene's, they deserve to be heard. Subscribe, share, and never look away.